Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was born in this apartment building in well-to-do suburbs of St. Paul, Minnesota, on September 24, 1894. Almost 100 years later, the area is a little run down, but many of the houses put up in Fitzgerald's time are still standing, imposing, stylish, and reflecting the stability and worth of the owners. His mother was Mary McQuillan. She was not very pretty, but good-tempered and romantic, and 30 years old when she married. She wore eccentric clothes and spent her time reading novels instead of looking after the family. Now demolished, this was the McQuillan family home. Her Irish immigrant father had been a grocer, and he had made and lost several fortunes, dying in his mid-40s. The Fitzgeralds, with their newborn son, were to be very glad of the McQuillan wealth. The early years of the baby Scott were spent moving around to different parts of the country, while his father sought work. The great problem was that Edward Fitzgerald, although a very agreeable person, was never able to hold down a job for long. He was a quiet and well-mannered man, however, and he tried to pass on his values to his son. The Fitzgerald family, although also Irish, had a longer pedigree than the McQuillans, and in this man, Francis Scott Key, an interesting forebear. He wrote the words for the Star-Spangled Banner, one of the great patriotic tunes of the United States, and here celebrated in this statue in Maryland. Bearing his name, the connection was one the writer Scott Fitzgerald was always to cherish. His widowed grandmother had moved from the big mansion into 294 Laurel Avenue. Still a large house and in a good area, but more suited to her requirements. It was a haven for the Fitzgeralds to return to in the early years of their marriage, when once again Edward Fitzgerald had lost his job. The view from the steps of the Laurel Avenue house is dominated by the Roman Catholic Cathedral. Very important in old Irish Catholic Mrs. McQuillan's life. It stands at the top of Summit Avenue, overlooking the Mississippi River. Perhaps it's not surprising that someone like Fitzgerald, who was soon to represent almost single-handed the rebellion of his times against the forces of tradition, should come from such a strong religious tradition himself. The fine houses of his St. Paul's childhood, the connection with Francis Scott Key, such matters were to be of lasting importance to the writer Fitzgerald. In his books, he was to show a deep understanding of the social values of his time, to be fully awake to the snobbishness of the rich and powerful. In St. Paul, you were in no doubt about who had made it. Yet Fitzgerald always needed to feel there was some distinction in his own background, to bolster up his flagging ego, perhaps. Looking down from the windows of the houses on Summit Avenue, you see the river, and plenty of signs of where the money comes from. The dignity of Summit Avenue was thoroughly grounded in the present. It lasted as long as the money did. In spite of his father's example, this was a lesson Scott Fitzgerald never learned. In this house, 399 Summit Avenue, St. Paul, they stayed a rather longer time, and this was where he largely grew up. The house was part of a block at the west end of the avenue, not quite so grand as the ones further up the hill. Still, with a little imagination, it could be seen as adjoining the best part of town. He was to be ever conscious that most of the friends he had lived in rather greater splendor, and more than anything, they could rely on stable family incomes. At St. Paul Academy, only a few blocks away, his grandmother's money paid for his tuition. He tried very hard to be socially successful there, a trait which was never to leave him, This was not such an unusual feature, except that with Fitzgerald, the intensity of effort he put into it was tremendous. At St. Paul's, he ended up being distinctly unpopular. He was consequently unhappy, and he neglected his schoolwork. The solution was to send him to a boarding school called Newman in Hackensack, New Jersey. These grounds, part of the local high school, are all that remain of Newman. The idea of a boarding school appealed to him tremendously, but here his efforts to make himself popular seemed to have, as usual, the opposite effect. It only made him try harder. At football, for instance, he had no natural aptitude and was rather below average height. After a year or two, he was accepted by the boys, and he made the football team of 1912. He suffered, no doubt, from the real poverty of his family, compared to many of the rich kids around him, but it did not seem to get him down. It was a Catholic school, in keeping with his mother's faith, and the headmaster was a man called Fay, afterwards Monsignor. A man with a strong personality who made a great impression on Fitzgerald. His success at sport made his school days easier, and certainly set him up for university. Back home in St. Paul, he had discovered the joys of amateur theatricals with a club called the Elizabethan Dramatic Club. He wrote several plays for them. The Coward was performed in the summer of 1913. He stage-managed and played a small part. He decided after Newman to go to Princeton University, also in New Jersey. He had heard that at Princeton there was a theatre club called the Triangle. It seemed just the thing for him. Princeton, when Fitzgerald arrived, was basically an undergraduate college. There were 1,500 students and 300,000 books in the library. It was a close-knit social group, not too big to get lost in, and if you were to shine, you could. Princeton was founded in 1746, over a century after Harvard. It had recently undergone many important changes in its structure and methods of teaching under the influence of Woodrow Wilson, the college president from 1902 to 1910. Wilson encouraged the Oxford and Cambridge ideas in the building of quadrangles to give the place intimacy. In the teaching, he introduced seminars to supplement the lectures. Fitzgerald was lucky, too, in that at Princeton he made friends who had fine minds. Henry Strater, for example, who read everything and acted according to what he thought was right without regard to social standing. Most of the students at the top U.S. universities were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, known by the acronym WASPs. At Newman, he had been amongst Catholics. Here, he had to make it in a new world. There were the clubs to which you had to be elected, a major feature of the students' social life. To those students left out, it seemed a distinctly undemocratic affair, and the practice was on the wane. However, he was duly elected to a club known as Cottage. The students ate together, and over a drink on the terrace, he enjoyed the discourse with the intellectual stars of the university, including the soon-to-be critic Edmund Wilson. As the libretto for this Triangle Club production shows, he was not slow in realizing his first ambition. For this he had the talents, and there he shone. Aside from appearing as a girl for publicity, he was soon working on the libretto for the next year's show and became editor of The Tiger, a key literary post. His uniqueness lay in the intense energy with which he pursued his social goals. The rich beauty Ginevra King was one of them. His poverty doomed their affair. He was, of course, equally determined to get into the college football team, in spite of his small stature and lack of talent. Palmer Stadium had been opened in 1914. Fitzgerald knew that success at Princeton meant not just academic success, but athletic success also. As soon as he knew he had passed the common entrance exams, he wired his mother to send his football pads and shoes. His social and athletic success had a bad effect on his academic work. He never learned to combine the two successfully, and he never completed his degree. This didn't stop him beginning his first novel. Like many others, he was inspired to enlist in the US Army, then about to enter the Great War. While training at Montgomery, Alabama, he met, then fell in love with Zelda Sale, the daughter of a judge. Fascinating for him, she had red hair, an attractive figure, and personality. To his regret, the war was soon over, and in no time he was out on the streets of New York with no job and only his passion for Zelda to give his life any distinction. He took a low-paid job in advertising. He worked hard on his short stories, though no one bought them. The engagement was broken off. His response was characteristic. He went on a blind drunk session, which only ended because prohibition was fortunately introduced. Then he walked out on his job. The publisher Scribner's had sent a remarkably positive letter about his novel, so he went back to the house in Summit Avenue to write his way out of his situation. All summer he worked on This Side of Paradise and sent it to Scribner's in September 1919. They accepted it within 2 weeks. Pretty quick for a first novel. The editor behind the decision was Max Perkins, a man who was to play a large part in his career. He apparently got the book printed before Mr. Scribner could see it. This Side of Paradise came out in March 1920 and was an immediate and enormous success. Fitzgerald wrote 9 stories before Christmas, and found that having a novel accepted meant people would buy his stories. With great good luck, he found a first-class agent who sold 3 stories for $1,300. All this persuaded Zelda that he wasn't such a bad catch after all. On April 3rd, they were married. The honeymoon turned out to be one long party in New York and Princeton, financed by the more than $18,000 Fitzgerald earned that year. They lived in hotels. At the Plaza, Fitzgerald is reputed to have frolicked in the fountain. It was a reckless and glittering time. "It costs more to ride on the top of taxis," said Zelda. Tabletops in restaurants were for dancing on if you had the vivacity and beauty she had. At the theatre, they laughed loudly in the wrong places. When you had the money to buy the clothes, it was a wonderful time for grace and style. Zelda had a great flair for enjoying herself. She threw herself into all this partying with boundless enthusiasm. Of course, he wrote on. More short stories emerging from their mad lifestyle, and his next novel, The Beautiful and Damned. The short stories proved extremely popular, and under the agent Harold Ober's direction, an excellent source of income, but he spent his money as fast as it came. The novel sold 40,000 copies in its first year and had a cover depicting a pair very like Scott and Zelda. On money borrowed from Scribner's, they took to living out of town at Great Neck in Long Island. From this house, they drove out and into Manhattan in their second-hand Rolls-Royce. The house was large and comfortable and quite able to support their continued life of style. This title of a collection of his short stories shows what they felt themselves to be. Partying continued either at clubs in town or with their friends at their house. The serious ideals of his Princeton days were quite in conflict with the hedonistic figure who rushed headlong through the rest of his life, trying to get the maximum pleasure and enjoyment out of it without counting the cost. He was the arch-priest of the flapper age. The houses in Gateway Drive were a demonstration of their vigour. If you could afford to buy this, then you had a right to go out and enjoy yourself. It is doubtful if many of the neighbours got through their riches as fast as the Fitzgeralds did, or could stand their pace. His play The Vegetable flopped on Broadway and left him $5,000 in debt. He retired to an upper room and wrote himself out of it. In 6 months he earned $17,000. The period at Great Neck ended with his article on how to live on $36,000 a year. He was surprised to find that he couldn't live on his income from writing. With money in hand, they went to Europe, where they felt things might be cheaper. France was a great attraction for literary Americans at the time, and the Fitzgeralds soon found themselves caught up in the artistic whirl. It took them to the Riviera, still at this time a place for the idle rich, not the busy holiday world it has now become. There, people lived in secluded houses and sailed their yachts. The Fitzgeralds were still living their exaggerated lifestyle and spinning along on success. The style of living in these houses, clustered around the promontory at Antibes, was not so very different from their world at Great Neck, except, of course, the dollar went a lot further. It was in and around these places that he wrote The Great Gatsby, and it was typical of Fitzgerald that in a social world that was extremely empty and extravagant, in a whirl of drinking and parties, he was able to express some of his deepest feelings about life. He actually stopped drinking for a time in August, so excited was he by his work. In the houses in Antibes, they met the cream of literary and artistic life. Their fame continued to open many doors. The occupants of the houses lived, as Fitzgerald saw it, the way life should be lived, gracefully, extravagantly. The Fitzgeralds' behavior was not always the most graceful, even when sober, throwing garbage over walls into parties to which they'd not been invited, for example. Kicking a tray of nuts and sweets from the hands of an old lady in the marketplace in Nice. This was Scott. There were beach parties and swimming in secluded coves. The background, it was to turn out, to parts of the novel Tender is the Night. It was life, however, turning into tragedy. Emotionally, theirs was always an unstable relationship. In September 1924, Zelda fell in love with a French aviator whom they had met in someone's house. It was a terrible blow to Fitzgerald, who had immensely strong feelings about the sanctity of love, and especially the love that bound him to Zelda. The development of this relationship became a torment to him. He drove the man off and demanded she give him up. As she was always to do, she succumbed to his authority. It was all over, but it left terrible scars that were to surface in his books. They turned to drinking and mutual distrust. Their drinking led them to quarrel with their friends, and the doors began to close on them. All this didn't hold up the writing of The Great Gatsby. He sent it off to Scribner's in November. They decided to winter in Rome. It was a bad move. They drank a lot and squabbled, but above all they felt the aristocratic Romans didn't care a fig for them, no matter how rich or notable they were. The Great Gatsby sold only 20,000 copies in its first year, which left them a bit short. They spent the summer of 1925 in Paris enjoying café life. They took an apartment in the Rue de Tilsit, where they are pictured with their daughter Scotty the following Christmas. The good life lived through a haze of alcohol was beginning to take its toll, however. The haze was becoming a nightmare. Fitzgerald was the most celebrated American literary figure in Paris. He met Hemingway and was instrumental in getting the first 2 Hemingway novels published through Scribner's. His assistance was always genuine, but he could readily fall out with people, as he was to do with Hemingway. Between 1926 and 1927, he wrote nothing. They returned to the States and were immediately invited to Hollywood to work on flapper scripts for the actress Constance Talmadge. The scene was new, but the party-going continued. They met everybody, and in the end, his script was rejected. They piled all their furniture in a heap in their hotel room, put the unpaid bills on top, and left. Via a few months drinking and fighting in a large house in Wilmington, Delaware, they returned to Paris. Zelda had decided she wanted to be a ballet dancer and threw herself desperately into a routine of training. It was part of her struggle for identity and an expression of the real talent she had. Fitzgerald's short stories kept them going. He earned $30,000 in 1928, but he still drank and became jealous of Zelda's dedication to her new art. Back on the Riviera, he was attempting to work things out for himself through his writing. As usual, the moralist was made anxious by the wastes of the gifts of the romantic enthusiast who would throw it all away for a moment's pleasure. Would he rather walk along the promenade, fascinating the company with his witty talk, or get down to work at his lonely desk? These tensions gave his work its remarkable dynamism. In April 1930, Zelda had a serious mental breakdown. She went to a psychiatric clinic in Switzerland, not far from Geneva, and it cost the then phenomenal sum of $1,000 a month. Scott was not allowed to visit. The doctor explained that her principal horror was of Scott's drinking. In contact with Scott, she developed terrible skin rashes. Only in September 1931 did the doctors think it was wise to leave Switzerland for the States. Much more material had been garnered for the novel Tender is the Night. Fitzgerald had been offered a contract in Hollywood for $12,000 a week, which he couldn't turn down. While he struggled with studios, Zelda remained at her family home in Alabama, but her father died in November, and the result was a second breakdown. She was taken to the Phipps Clinic in Baltimore. Tender is the Night was published in April 1934. At a time of depression and the political rise of the working man, a book about the doings of the rich on the Riviera could hardly be a success. Meanwhile, Zelda had written a novel, Save Me the Waltz, which was largely an attack on Fitzgerald. She sent it to Perkins. His Hollywood reputation for drunken behavior made jobs difficult to get, until in 1937 he was offered a new contract at $1,000 per week. He settled enthusiastically into the Garden of Allah, but it didn't last. Failure meant lower rates of pay, which meant reduced circumstances, like these old apartments on Sunset Boulevard. The surroundings are deceptive. Hollywood deteriorates very quickly at the edges. A third of his salary went to pay old debts to his agent Ober and his publisher Scribner's. At this time he still believed he might succeed as a screenwriter. It was not all gloom. One advantage of the move to Hollywood was that he met Sheila Graham. She was a remarkable English girl who'd come from the poorest part of London's East End and was now an influential gossip column writer in Hollywood. An astonishing climb. Against the rich and exaggerated background of Hollywood, he certainly fell in love with her, and as far as the alcohol would allow, he committed himself to her just at a time when he needed such a commitment. But in Hollywood, things fade fast when they are not successful. In spite of the help from Sheila, his downward spiral of alcoholism was accelerated. He settled for a time at Malibu Beach. Sheila broke her engagement with an English lord and settled in with him. It was a brave move, and she gave him a stability and will to live that he badly needed. The agonies he suffered over Zelda's breakdown, for which he blamed himself, and the horrors of his own literary failure were incomprehensible to him. It was something to succeed, but to succeed and then fail as he had done was a bitter cup to drink. In the endless suburbs of Hollywood, he settled again to write short stories and begin what was to be his last unfinished novel, The Last Tycoon. Sheila took him on a holiday trip to Mexico, and his stories, along with an offer to write a script, gave him some money and a respite. He had met everyone, however, and on the director Irving Thalberg, he modelled The Last Tycoon. It was Hollywood exposed from the inside, but he was in a race with time. A newspaper man came to interview him, and with typical friendliness, Fitzgerald invited him in. The resulting cruel article was devastating. His novel, The Last Tycoon, was now all that he had time for. In December, he told Perkins that he would finish the first draft by mid-January. But his body had suffered too much, and he died of a heart attack on 21st December 1940. The Catholic Church refused permission for the cemetery burial of an immoral writer. Years later, Scotty had her parents' remains moved to this grave in Maryland. There was just enough money to pay for his funeral, and in that year Scribner's sold 47 copies of his books. Of The Great Gatsby alone, they have now sold several million. Whatever the judgment of his own age, time has given him the accolade he deserved.